and the ambassador. I'm never going to accept an invitation where I have to talk after the ambassador. It's especially embarrassing since I'm a historian and was taking notes. I feel like I just got a master class in European history and Swedish history. Anyway, that's a learning experience. I won't do that again. I'm from Yonsei, GSIS. So that's the other thing. This is enemy territory over here. So I feel like I walked into a trap. But I'm very happy to be here. I come in peace. As far as our two GSISs, I was just telling some of the organizers of our graduate student association, there used to be a conference, I think somehow it went away, where you guys would do a conference with Korea University and Yonsei, the GSISs. So hopefully you'll hear from emissaries, peace emissaries, to revive that conference. So it's great to be here. I might give a slightly shorter talk and leave room for a little bit more discussion. I taught this morning my 3-hour seminar in US-China relations, and then a class on North Korean history and politics. So I'm a little sick of hearing my own voice. And those were such great questions to the ambassador that I'd also like to leave ample time for a little dialogue. But I'll try and lay out some big picture ideas that will serve as a foundation for us to explore a little bit more based on your interests as individuals and as a group. And so I was also given one of these absurd categories about peace and prosperity or peace and security in Northeast Asia. So you got Europe and now you get Asia. But sometimes it's good to have this huge question and you really have to think, okay, what is essential here? What is really important? And I didn't use a historical sort of method, though I'm happy to talk from a historical perspective a little bit later, but I approach this more in terms of three of what I see are the really big trends in this region. And there's a bias here. These are the things I follow most closely, but still I think they pass muster as objectively. These are some of the major developments. And the first one, I think, unarguably, is probably the defining peace and security question for the region, and that's US-China relationship, or US-China strategic competition, which is the new phrase in the United States. So I'll kind of start with sharing some thoughts about that, different ways for us to understand that development and think where it might be heading, and ways in which probably ultimately I think it threatens peace and security in East Asia, threatens the East Asian peace. Sweden has a great record, I just learned, of 205 years of peace. And as some Swedish and Nordic scholars actually have done a lot of work on, there's an East Asian peace, which is that this region has a very good record of, depending on how you want to date it, maybe 40 years. You could go back, if you really want to stretch it, you could go back to China's invasion of Vietnam in 1979 and look at that as really the last major conflict. That's the end of a period of time where East Asia is an area of massive war, and as a percentage of global war deaths, it's concentrated in East Asia from, say, 1945 to 1979. But since then, it's remarkable how that number plummets, and that's held true to today. So those of you who are from this region and we're living in it now, we're benefiting also from this long, sustained period of peace and prosperity. So the first topic will be, I think, what is something we ultimately need to understand as a threat to that East Asian peace, which is the changing dynamics between the United States and China. And then I'll talk a bit about the inter-Korean effort to make a massive leap toward a peace breakthrough. That's also not going very well these days, but we can talk a little bit about that. And then the last topic I want to bring up is much more of a question mark thing, but is whether there's a sort of future connection between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. So those are my three. I'll have the least to say about that last topic. So this man needs no introduction, Thucydides. You've all heard the Thucydides trap. I assume this is another one of the kind of terms that caught on that does really capture a lot of the thinking in the United States and in China. What I see, I've been based here since 2010, but I'm an American. I go to the United States and listen in on the conversation. I go to China and listen into the Chinese conversation. And the Thucydides trap, there's a kind of agreement, and there has been for quite a while. This is relevant. This is a useful way to frame our problem. So Chinese scholars use it, American scholars use it. And of course, probably you're all familiar, I'll give the very quick version of what that trap means, but it's, bread and butter. This is classic, literally 2,500 years old international relations theory, right? Stemming from Thucydides, from his History of the Peloponnesian War, that this is the danger of power transition, of a rising power, that it challenges the hegemonic power, the established power, and that there's a pattern, a historical pattern, of an increased likelihood, a high likelihood. You enter kind of a red zone as the rising power gets closer to the established power. There's a high likelihood that there's going to be a conflict. Thucydides is using that. He basically invents that concept as a description of what happened in the conflict between Athens and Sparta, where Sparta felt challenged by the rise of Athens, and almost inevitably the two that led to war. And then the historical pattern is not 100%. So again, I think this is familiar to students at a place like GSIS. It's a question of probabilities. And can two states that enter into this kind of red zone, are they going to make it through? Can they make it through without a war, without a conflict? So Graham Allison, who coined, or well, I think he coined, certainly popularized this phrase, and I was at a conference in Harvard a couple weeks ago where he was one of the speakers. So he frames this as destined for war, question mark, right? Is this inevitable? And his basic answer is no, it's not inevitable, but we are in the red zone, right? We are entering a period where there's increased dangers of this kind of conflict between the U.S. and China. So that's one way of understanding it. Almost a neutral, the Thucydides trap is almost a kind of neutral framework that, again, you can see Americans and Chinese agree to the extent that they agree they're sort of moving into that sort of zone. In terms of paradigms, the other two that I would highlight that are not necessarily shared, one is the Chinese concept of how to get through this Thucydides trap, and the other is the American concept of paradigm for how to get through this period of entering a trap. And so the Chinese one is closely associated with the current leader, with Xi Jinping. He didn't invent the phrase, but he gave it real prominence even before he became the official leader of the Communist Party and of China. And that's this notion. Do you guys all know? I don't want to be boring you with stuff that you just heard this lecture this morning. Who knows the Xi? Where are our Xiologists? What is like the Xi Jinping concept paradigm for U.S.-China relations? Does anyone know that phrase? It's kind of a catchphrase, a buzzword phrase. Anyone out there? Okay. Well, that's good. That means this is still somewhat new for people. So the big phrase is new type of great power relations. It's a mouthful. It's not quite as sleek. It doesn't have the alliteration of Thucydides trap. But new type of great power relations is something that you'll encounter all over Chinese discursive space when they're discussing. And again, it's at the official level. It actually started more from the academic world of Chinese theorists, saying we need a new type of great power relations. And Xi Jinping has grabbed onto it and held onto it. And so that's sort of the Xi Jinping Chinese proposal to the United States. And he ultimately, in a summit context with then President Obama, really sort of put that over and said, how about this? How about a new type of great power relations? And Obama and his team didn't quite know how to react. They're first like, okay, all right. And then later like, maybe we shouldn't have agreed to that. We never agreed to that. Right? So it was not embraced, but there's a kind of ambivalent reaction. So what does new type of great power relations mean? The phrase provides a kind of intended ambiguity. It's just new type. So exactly what it's going to be, what form it will be, is, I would say, deliberately not spelled out. The one thing it tells us is it will not be the old type. That's kind of all we really know for sure, right? And what is the old type of great power relations? The old type of great power relations is the pattern throughout history going back to the Peloponnesian War, that when a rising, challenging, revisionist power comes up, it goes to war with, actually the established power goes to war with it in order to prevent that rise, to prevent the challenge to its hegemony, right? So at the most basic level, and this was pretty much explicit by Xi Jinping and many Chinese kind of commentators who were trying to explain what this phrase meant, the only thing we can really take to the bank is new type of great power relations means no war. Whatever we're going to do is unclear how this is all going to play out, what it means for our relationship, but it will not be a war relationship, right? So that's been out there for quite a while. And I would say the Obama administration never really had, at a kind of paradigm level, they didn't have a response. The closest thing you may have heard of was the pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia, I would say, was not really a paradigm. We can argue what's a paradigm, but the pivot to Asia was temporary. I mean, the very word pivot is temporal. You know, it's like we're trying to get out of the Middle East because it's mostly wars that nobody likes, and we want to get over to East Asia because everybody's making money over there. You know, so we're pivoting, trying to pivot away from the Middle East to East Asia. But it also had a kind of ambiguity, but it didn't really say, what are you going to do once you're over in East Asia, right? Once the pivot's over, then what? Okay, you've transferred military assets, you've transferred your diplomatic focus, you want to be more involved in East Asian whatever. How so? What's your vision for it, right? So the pivot was a kind of, and then was much criticized within the United States. So I would say, for the Obama administration, for the first period when Xi had this new type of great power relations, there wasn't really a clear answer to that. I think only it's basically been over the last year, I would say now, there is an answer. There is a clear answer, whether you like it or not, that, in my perception, has pretty strong consensus behind it as well in the United States, even though it's a Trump administration term, which is hard to do. Not a lot of Trump stuff you can say it's got a strong consensus, broad-based consensus in the United States. But this one probably does. We could argue about that, but in my perception it does at a certain level. And that is strategic competition. Strategic competition was written into the official authoritative statements of the US government, of the Defense Department. And what those documents have done, and you're seeing it play out in the policy, is they have really said we're in a new era in terms of peace and security. The threat to national security for the United States, the threat really to the world order, is presented by China and Russia. This is very explicit, this is written in the documents, right? And these are great powers, and we have entered this era of great power competition. It's quite, you have to give credit to these documents for their bluntness. It literally says, we're not focused on terrorism anymore, we're now focused on China and Russia. And the term for that is we're in a strategic competition with them. Great power competition. Another, to me, really almost shocking term is peer rivalry, peer competition. So that's a cluster of terms that you hear a lot, and strategic competition is one I hear sort of the most, that I think has kind of consensus behind it. So that is the American view of sort of how to respond to this proposal of new type of great power relations. In a way, you could say, new type of great power relations is a kind of question. You want a new type of great power relations? You don't want to do the old type, right? And the answer is, yeah, we probably don't want to do the old type. We want to do this type, which is we compete with you. Strategic, on all levels, long term. And of course, we're going to win. Right? You don't go into a game of the board game Risk, or my daughter's obsessed with card games, so every morning I wake up at 7 and she's like, gentlemen, You know, I'm like, okay, let's play. So I use the card game to think about games, connect them with IR and all these things, right? You don't go into games planning to lose. You go into games planning to win, figuring out how am I going to defeat my opponent, even when it's your adorable 10-year-old daughter. I want to beat her in these 7 a.m. games, right? So the United States is certainly going into this long-term game, strategic game, to compete and to win. China, of course, is going into it to win as well, right? And so the nice answer would be win-win. That would be kind of the rules-based order, liberal, everyone's happy. But certainly when you look at the politics of someone like Donald Trump, it's not about win-win, right? So it could change, because strategic competition goes beyond Donald Trump. We have to be very careful to isolate the Trump factor. It's there, but it's not the whole thing. So it will go beyond him, but at least in its current iteration, it's associated with a leader of the United States who has a open philosophy of, I win, I, Donald Trump, win, you're fired, and we, America, win. America first is the philosophy of the democratically elected president. So I've already put a lot out on the table, hopefully enough to stimulate some discussion, and of course we can go deeper in many of these dimensions. I guess the other way, you know, as an American who's traveled to China, lived in China, has close Chinese friends, etc., you know, of course I'm seeing it in the context just of US-China relations as kind of a binary. But I've lived here for a while, we're here. There are a lot of countries in between the US and China. Physically, geographically, economically, even more so. It's a long list. So this is why you have that horrible platitude that I put in my syllabus, you know, the most important relationship for, you know, the 21st century and these things. For now, it's true. There's probably no other single bilateral relationship that entangles so many other countries, right, within that. And especially in our neck of the woods. And so in terms of this competition, we can see also the emergence of, again, if we use the concept of paradigms, two different paradigms or visions of what the region should look like, competing visions of the region. And they're basically two competing forms of centrism, sinocentrism, a China-centered vision of the region, and Americans are so lucky there's not even a good word for it, Amerocentrism? What do you even call it, right? It's amazing we don't have a word. We have a word, sinocentrism, but there's no word for the American equivalent. The hub and spoke system of alliances. But so there's an emerging, and again, when we talk in terms of the challenge of a rising power, it's not just within the binary bilateral relationship of the US and China, it's very much certainly within a regional framework, and even we're on the cusp of it as a global challenge, right? And so that's where things like the BRI, China's Belt and Road Initiative, I'm sure many of you are, everyone's probably aware of it at some level, some of you maybe are studying it in your classes or for papers of this kind of thing. One thing that's remarkable about BRI is it is a global vision. It's a pretty friendly vision, it's very economic development oriented, but it also is implicitly, sometimes explicitly, sinocentric. It is a China-centered vision. And it's really an alternate vision. It's a challenging vision to the Amerocentric status quo. When America looks at the world, it looks, you know, at a world that revolves around it. You look in terms of military power, the United States has commands, Central Command, right? Southern Command, Strategic Command is kind of everything and who we're going to nuke, right? And this part of the world used to be in PACOM, Pacific Command. Literally divide, imagine the gall of dividing the entire world into military quadrants, right? This is how the world works from an American perspective. These are real military powers around the world. So renaming one of those quadrants has a significance to it. And just in the last, I forget when it was, 6 months ago, I think, the Pacific Command, PACOM, was renamed Indo-Pac. I'm not sure what they're calling it quite yet. The Indo-Pacific Command. That is a manifestation you could say it's symbolic, but in a very, in terms of the name of the military power and the vision of the military, linking the, more traditional Pacific, which includes East Asia, across now, sweeping it across to connect it to India, to the Indian Ocean. What's that about? Why now is the United States renaming Pacific Command, which seemed perfectly fine as PACOM? Why rename it Indo-Pac? It's pretty obvious. This is about adding another piece to holding in a vision, an American-centric vision of order in this region where the power is the power, where is Hawaii? Here, headquarters of PACOM, which ultimately answers, of course, to Washington. So this is just one element of it. I think, though, it's quite significant. Maybe you can say I've stacked the deck. But the Chinese, the Sino-centric vision is very much still an economically driven vision. The American status quo vision is very much a military vision. It's kind of raw peace and security. The ideological or values side of it is, yeah, but it's all about rules, we protect rules. And that's fair. But it is using military power to back it up. Whereas China is promoting its vision very much in the language of economic development and prosperity. Okay, so I think this is the other problem of being a professor is you say you're sick of talking and hearing your own voice, but then you just naturally speak in 50-minute blocks, because that's just how it comes out. So I'm going to go really fast through the second and third, and then we can turn this into more of a dialogue. Yeah, I guess I reversed the order. This is a quick point, and I'd be curious actually also for thoughts, especially those of you from different parts of the region. This is a very exploratory kind of tentative idea that I find myself thinking about more and more, which is how do you respond to this challenge, especially the degree to which the challenge is ultimately two rival powers. I mean, maybe we like the US better, maybe people like China better, maybe you feel safer with the US role or even safer with the Chinese role. Wherever you fall in that, at some level, it's just two nation states who want hegemony. They want power. And from that perspective, this is a danger for all of us because the power is shifting from one to the other. And there is a historical pattern, the Thucydides trap, where those two go to war. And that is not good for any of us, for the rest of us in this region. It's not good for Sweden, I don't think. It's not good, on a global basis, given how much is at stake. So what are smart ways for the world to respond to this, and for this region to respond? So anyway, one that I find myself thinking about is I don't know what to call it, but it's kind of an arc that connects Northeast Asia from Southeast Asia. And how much more can be done to give that some muscle and even some bone. Right now the links are quite tentative and there's very little structured institutional linkages between Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. There are economic ties there. You take a country here like South Korea, and those of you who focus on trade relationships, what's the big growing trade relationship for South Korea? It's Vietnam. Right? Vietnam is really the rising, that's where the action is. And for a while, apart from all these other, for various reasons, South Korea, companies as well as government have been looking to kind of reduce exposure to China, much of it for market reasons, and look for other markets where they see a better future. And Vietnam is one of the big ones, Southeast Asia in general. So I think that's an area where there's very little there and to be done. Of course, there's ASEAN, and so Southeast Asia, when we talk about European models, ASEAN is on its way toward a kind of European community level of regional integration. At least there's some kind of institutional structure for that. Obviously, it's much, much less than what Europe has, but it's something. Northeast Asia, my God, everyone just hates everyone else up here, right? I mean, there is no format for it. The only real format that existed was the six-party talks, which was really ultimately focused on the North Korean nuclear challenge and has been defunct. It was really only around for 5 years. It could have evolved into a Northeast Asian security mechanism, but it didn't. It's even possible that the conflicts, the contradictions in Northeast Asia are so intense. There might be better hope in Northeast Asia connecting not within a Northeast Asian context, but by sort of connecting to Southeast Asia. That makes sense. So you look at the state of South Korea-Japan relations right now, which are terrible for very complex reasons. It might be easier for South Korea and Japan, even in an institutional mechanism, peace and security mechanism, to kind of meet in Hanoi, in an almost neutral territory, where they agree, and the other countries in that, and Australia, where I spent a couple months recently, there's a lot of overlapping agreement of none of us want a war between the US and China. None of us want to have to choose one or the other. All of us want to restrain actually both sides, maintain these very complicated good relationships with both. That's going to be, I guess the point of the first discussion is that's going to be harder and harder and harder to do, to sustain. That's been quite sustainable for a while, but that's going to be harder and harder to sustain. So that's really a challenge for the region, and being proactive about it might be smart. How much time have I spent? I'm not going to start this. If I start this, of the original 30 minutes?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so peace and reunification of the Korean Peninsula in 2 minutes, so that I gave that extra 3 minutes. I was 3 minutes shorter than the ambassador in deference. No. We can discuss, where we all think the process and the details and almost like tactical level of it. But I guess I would just make one very broad point at this level of generalization, which is, to me, the driver. There's a big debate about the driver of the process and the reversal. There was a reversal from Fire and Fury 2017, where at least my students' parents were emailing, being like, should I bring my little Joey home, to Kansas? Is it safe over there? And I said back, I have no idea, I don't know. But 2017, that there were signs of a serious possibility of conflict. That was a real possibility in a way it hadn't been in a long time. And then suddenly, 2018, probably the classic line Donald Trump said at a rally about Kim Jong-un, we're in love. Okay, so from Fire and Fury, we're going to destroy you with the power the likes of which the world has never seen, to we're in love. There's all kinds of theories and debates about how to explain that reversal. It's multi-causal, but I would focus on Kim Jong-un. I do think Kim Jong-un's the key driver behind the change. And again, at a zoomed out level, I think what Kim Jong-un, what his strategy is, what he is trying to do, is to normalize North Korea. And that has many levels to it. The biggest one internally is focusing on economic development, which he, a year ago, explicitly said, we are now 100% all about economic development, which is kind of radical within the context of North Korean history. Part of why I wanted to teach the course this term was to check, is that true? And so far from our work in the class, it's true. This is not the North Korean playbook to say we're just 100% focused on the economy. So that's a major part of why Kim Jong-un is quite different, and the way in which he wants to normalize, because of course that's weird by North Korean standards. That's completely the norm within East Asia. That's what every East Asian country has done, has shifted from the militarism of Sweden in the 17th century to the economic development focus of the Sweden that we know and love when we drive our Volvos to IKEA for meatballs. So Kim Jong-un wants a normalization of North Korea in that context. And I think the other way in which he wants a normalization of North Korea is to make it more like South Korea, Singapore, Japan, Australia. All these countries want to stay in between the US and China. And a lot of what's driving Kim Jong-un to have these meetings with Donald Trump, as well as working out a different relationship with South Korea, is moving North Korea into the norm of the region. Because one of the problems he inherited is North Korea is China's only defense treaty ally. You'd think that's good. That's not good. When you're also the only country in the world that the United States has never formally recognized as a sovereign country. That's a position, that's an anomaly that Kim Jong-un wants to try to get out of. And that's a lot of what's driving the diplomacy.